Hi everyone, welcome to this event by Champaca Bookstore with Shrabani Basu in conversation with Vivek Shanbhag about her latest book, The Mystery of the Parsi Lawyer. I'll just introduce Champaka and the speakers and then hand the conversation over to them. Champaka is an independent women run bookstore, children's library, and cafe. We bring diverse stories and perspectives for our readers and in our children's library through our books and events. We have an online store that ships across India where you can find all the books on our shelves, including The Mystery of the Parsi Lawyer. Shrabani Basu is a journalist and Sunday Times best-selling author. Her books include the critically acclaimed Mystery of the Parsi Lawyer, For King and Another Country, Victoria and Abdul, Spy Princess, and Kari, the story of the nation's favorite book. She has always combined her journalism with her love of history, and all her books have evolved from her observations about the shared histories of India and Britain. Vivek Shanbhag is the author of 8 works of fiction and 2 plays, all of which have been published to wide acclaim in Canada. He was a fall 2016 resident of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. Rachar Gochar is the first of his books to appear in English. Now a little bit about the book. In the village of Great Wyrley near Birmingham, someone is mutilating horses. Someone is also sending threatening letters to the vicarage, where the vicar, Shahpur Edalji, is a Parsi convert to Christianity and the first Indian to have a parish in England. His son George, quiet, socially awkward, and the only boy at school with distinctly Indian features, grows up into a successful barrister till he is improbably linked to and then prosecuted for the above crimes in a case that left many convinced that justice hadn't been served. When he is released early, his conviction still hangs over him. Having lost faith in the police and the legal system, George turns to the one man he believes can clear his name, the one whose novels he spent his time reading in prison, the creator of the world's greatest detective. When he writes to Arthur Conan Doyle asking him to meet, Conan Doyle agrees. The mystery
Don't
of the
give away too much,
Parsi
Nirika.
Lawyer. That's it. This is all only the public information.
Yeah.
Uh, it's an eye-opening look at race and an unexpected friendship in the early days of the 20th century. You can get your copy on www.champaca.in. We ship across the country. I'd also like to ask anyone who's viewing, if you have any questions at any point, please just write them in the comments and the speakers will get to them towards the end of the event. Handing over the conversation to you.
Thank you, Nirika. And Shrabani, first of all, congratulations for a wonderful book. What a
Thank you.
fascinating book this is. It is so compelling. Once you start, it is impossible to stop this. And as I was telling you, I did it in, I read it in 2 sittings. Once, 200 pages in one sitting, and the rest in the second one. It's fantastic. And the
Thank you.
narrative
Thank you so
is,
much.
and the narrative is, it is almost, it's like fiction, and it happens because I think you have eye for details, and as I was telling you, some time ago, that it is like what a fiction writer does, picking up significant detail, what James Joyce calls a significant detail. And there is absolutely, it is filled with so many details, and the story and the narrative unwinds in such a beautiful way, but there's not even once that the details are repetitive and uninteresting. It's a fantastic book, and congratulations again.
Thank you so
Before
much.
we yeah,
I must
before
tell you,
we
Vivek, I
yeah,
read your book in one go. So I beat you there. Gachar Gochar, which is only one in translation, but it had such beautiful detail. I could smell the food and
thank
made
you,
me very hungry.
thank you.
The South Indian cooking and everything that is going on. Oh. Right.
Yeah. Now, before I really ask you something about your art of writing, which I'll do maybe end of this conversation,
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about this book. When was the seed of this book sown? And what I mean is, what really made you go after this story? And who is this Parsi lawyer you are talking about?
Right. Okay, so let's start with the Parsi lawyer. He is 28-year-old George Edalji. He is a lawyer. He works in Birmingham. He lives in a village called Great Wyrley, where his father, Shahpurji Edalji, is the vicar of this. And here we have this lovely photo. You can see this is the family. Shahpurji in his, priest robes. He's the vicar of the place. He's the first Asian vicar of, to have his own parish in the UK. And of course, Shahpurji he is from Bombay. He converted. He was a Parsi. He converted as a teenager to Christianity, and he wanted to go and study, and become a priest. So he funds his own way, and he comes to England. And finally, he marries a white lady. Her name is Charlotte. She's English, and through connections, whatever, he gets this vicar, this job as the vicar. So he's the vicar, and then they have three children. George is the eldest. You can see him here. He's about 16 or 17, and his younger brother Horace and younger sister Maud. So that's George Edalji, who is our main character. And this is the vicarage, Great Wyrley. It's a mining village. So the composition of the village is sort of land, those who work in the mines and those who are agricultural laborers, as well as the aristocracy. So it's a very mixed bag. And suddenly, to this all-white parish, we have a brown man speaking with an Indian accent and preaching the word of Christ to his white parish. So it's tension from scene one, you can imagine. So that's the backdrop. How did I come to this story? I knew about George. I knew, I've always been an Arthur Conan Doyle big fan. And I knew that, his biographies and other things, books on Asians in Britain, I knew that the only case he'd ever worked on was that of an Indian lawyer that he had investigated personally. So that was really important to me. I needed to follow this up sometime. But it was only in 2015 that I started working on the book. In 2015, I read a little newspaper report that some letters were going up for auction. And these were letters written by Arthur Conan Doyle to the police chief who had been investigating the Edalji case. So for me as a journalist, I just felt, there's something in this. There's going to be new material. And when I write, I always want new material. I want the real story. And, that is what I was looking for. So I followed up the trail. And so it really started in 2015 when I found those letters. I went to the library finally, got those letters, and then worked around in various other archives, and took 5 years and got the story.
Shahpurji, when he was in Mumbai and that conversion episode, when he was in Elphinstone College, it's such a wonderful thing because it is so much different than what we at least have read and heard, because you take us into a particular family, you take us into the mind of this young man who was genuinely interested in a new religion, and he believed it, and you can see that in the rest of his life. So what kind of research went into this to find out about, did you have to do that in India, that research, or how did you get to know all these details?
Yeah, so no, I went in, the archives here are really good. So searching a little bit about Shahpurji. Nirika, there's the photograph after this of the vicarage. Would you bring that up? Yeah, so this is the vicarage where they lived. This is George's room as well on the side. Yep, you can take these away now if you like. So then we'll come to the next photographs later, so you could take these away. Thanks, Nirika. Yeah. Basically, he went to He's from a wealthy Parsi family. As you know, these Parsi families had business interests, textile, cotton, even running the opium, ships. They were very, very prosperous. And so he had been sent to this elite Elphinstone College. Now, Elphinstone College, there was a Reverend Wilson there, and he looked at the Parsis. He was, he had this missionary zeal, and he is going to try and recruit Parsis. They were seen as a community that could, because they were westernized, and the English related, very easily with them. he felt they could be, they were a target. So there were a lot of conversions suddenly taking place of students in this college, and the parents were really agitated. So there's a lot in the book about, how the parents go, and there's actually a siege on Reverend Wilson's house, and armed police come in. And Shahpurji is just 15 years old. He's very influenced, and he's very passionate. He wants to study the Christian texts. And eventually he lands up at his door. He runs away from home. He lands up at Wilson's door and says, "Take me in." And so we have Wilson's records, which I accessed here to, answer your question. And
Yeah.
Wilson's recounts the whole story. And he writes about the sermon. He writes about how what Edalji says when he is baptized. So he is baptized in the Amroli church in Bombay, and he speaks like an evangelist. He, discards his religion and says how uncivilized it was, and he's now going to be, become civilized and things like that. So, it's all that zeal of a new convert that you hear from Shahpurji as a very young boy. He's just 15. But yeah, all these records were there in Wilson's writing. So he's written quite extensively. So I was lucky. It's a good thing they keep detailed records. It's very handy for us.
See, there is in your other books as well. There's enormous amount of archaeological research that has gone in, whether it is Victoria Abdul or Noor Inayat Khan or other books. Now, was this any different, this particular experience, or was it similar? How does it change from book to book? Is it because of the story, or is it because of I'm really curious because the kind of effort that goes in and the amount of information that we have to arrange and uh,
Mhm.
get into that time, because you take us so smoothly and beautifully into that time in the mid 19th century and the later part of that time. So was this any different, this particular writing this particular book and going through this details, and
It
also
was.
because of Doyle, but I'll come to that later.
It was different because each book has been slightly different. Whether I was doing Victoria and Abdul was royalty, so I had to enter that world and, go in the royal palaces and the royal archives, and it was different research, though it was in the Victorian period. So luckily, this was also Victorian period, so I've got that in common. And but of course, this for the first time I was looking at police records, which I've not done before. With Victoria, I was looking at her letters and archives and her letters to the Viceroy, Secretary of State. So a lot of Home Office, Foreign Office files, even there, Viceroy's papers. But here I was looking at police records, court case, trial records. And so all that was very exciting. Also, as a journalist myself, I always rely on newspaper reports. So for me, those are really important. And because how else do you know what these people of the village are thinking? Only a local journalist will be writing about the terror that's happening, how frightened people are, and to get the sense of, what's happening in this village, what they think of George Edalji. The only way I can get that sense is from the newspaper reports. And believe me, they were shocking. they, the racism was absolutely shocking, just stark written over there, writing about it. I might read a few as we go along.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is what happened to the family, this odd one sole Indian family in the village, um, just completely frowned upon by everybody else and targeted incessantly.
Your introduction is beautiful. It makes you want to read the book. And after reading the book, I read the introduction again because it opens up so beautifully with the train leaving Birmingham station, and then so many things which make again it the whole book can be seen in a different light. So I suggest to the readers that you read the introduction twice. It does because one appreciates really the amount of work that has gone in and the way you have composed this, because as I said, it's almost reads like fiction because the kind of narrative and the way you have, see, for example, the life of Conan Doyle and then life of George. I could see these two streams coming. and then joining at a certain point in time.
Mhm.
Can you talk about it?
Yeah, of course. So what happens is, well, just for all those who are listening in who don't know
Yeah.
much about the story, I know Nirika has done a little cap, but basically what happens in this village is that in 1903, which is when the book is really set, is that there's sudden terror in the village, and horses are being slashed. Somebody is coming at night and mutilating horses, slashing their stomachs and just leaving them to die. All their innards are, spilling out on the fields. It's absolutely gruesome. And for 6 months, this goes on. Every day, there's a horse lying there. As George is passing on this train and he's going to Birmingham, he looks out and there's a horse dead lying there. So, this sort of thing. Villagers are in a complete panic. And anonymous letters, as the rumor mills go around, who has done this, anonymous letters start, and they start targeting George and saying he's the one who did it. So the police get influenced, and the police, of course, are so prejudiced, and they're totally, absolutely inept at catching this criminal, and they just go in and arrest George when a horse is killed quite close to the vicarage. They just get in there and they arrest him, and then he's tried in a really farcical trial with very minimum evidence, which would not have been allowed in any court. And it takes 55 minutes for the jury to say he's guilty, and off he goes. He's sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. So he's locked up. And meanwhile, oh, yes, yeah, let's have a look at this picture. Sorry. This is George when he's arrested. So here we are. He looks terrible because I mean, these police photographs, they always look so horrible because he's so shocked. He just, just suddenly being arrested like this. He's a man who led such an ordinary life. He would just, a very boring life. He had no friends. He was a bit of a loner. As you can see, his features are very, very pronounced Indian features. Though his mother is white, there's nothing white at all. You can make out that he is Indian. And so his features become really important in this whole case. As I mentioned, the press reports. Vivek, I'll just read out one thing
Yeah,
um,
sure.
from a newspaper report. Nirika, you could take this away actually now, and I'll just read a little bit about what these reporters say. It's shocking. So when the judgment, this 55 minutes, he's pronounced guilty. The Daily Mail writes, those who closely studied this extraordinary criminal in the dock would have no doubt that he's a degenerate of the worst type. His jaw and mouth are those of a man of very debased life. Idalji has also gained for himself the reputation of being a lover of mystery, another Oriental trait, and one that goes far to explain the anonymous letters. Love of mystery rather than bloodlust was, according to the Crown, the predisposing motive. So, this whole thing that he's an Oriental, the dark Oriental who must have done this crime. And then we have the Birmingham Daily Gazette writing, the explanation of the choice is probably to be found in the circumstance that Edalji is of Eastern extraction. The subtle Eastern mind loves a mystery and is vain. The Eastern mind is satisfied with its secret. So you can see how these are the reporters, local reporters writing. And then one writes, we are glad to think that the district of Great Wyrley and the country is safe from such a monster for several years to come. Now, I mean, George Adulci is no monster. He'd never done anything in his life. He'd written a very boring book on railway law for the commuters. That was the extent of his skill. And he had no friends. He was a teetotaler. He didn't go to the pub. He didn't do any of the normal things that most of his colleagues would have done. So in a sense, and because he looked so different, he stood out. Also, he was myopic, so you can see he had slightly bulging eyes, and sometimes he couldn't recognize somebody, so he might just stare at somebody and not recognize them, not say hello. So immediately they think he's odd. So that was another problem going with him. So the entire focus is on his appearance and his Eastern looks and his Eastern background, and this sets up this case. And of course um, he's imprisoned now for 7 years. But what happens is that a little campaign starts and he is released on parole after 3 years. And that's when he can't practice because he's been struck off the solicitor's rolls. He can't even live in Great Wyrley because he says, if I go back and another horse is killed, they'll stick me in again. He goes and lives in London. He has no earnings. So he just doesn't know what to do. And he writes to Arthur Conan Doyle and he says, help me. Nirika, we have a photo of Arthur Conan Doyle, I think. So would you like to bring that up?
Shabani, I like the way you bring Conan Doyle, because it is not just that it doesn't start from the point when George writes to him.
Right.
We almost we it starts much before that, and with his wife and her illness, and so we
Yeah.
actually have a glimpse into his life, and
Yeah.
then you can see that slowly, he is almost like, he was waiting for such a break.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
is beautifully done, because then that's what I meant by, these two
Yeah. So the
streams
two
come, and
strands.
then that's where they
Yeah.
join.
Yeah. Nirika, you could take this away now. Thanks. We've seen Sherlock. So basically, yes, because he comes into the story quite late. The trial
Yeah.
has happened till he writes to him. So, but I needed to know what was happening in Arthur Conan Doyle's life at this stage. And the interesting thing was that while, Arthur Conan Doyle himself was, he had killed off Holmes, he was fed up of his creation. He sent him down the Reichenbach Falls, killed him off. And then everybody said, bring him back, Holmes can't die. So he had to bring him back. And so this whole story is going on. And in this crucial year, 1903, when all this is happening in Great Wyrley, is when Holmes is coming back. So, a second chapter in Arthur Conan Doyle's life is starting with, the return of Holmes. So I found these two strands quite interesting before they come together. And then in 1906, when he gets this letter from George, this is a time in his life when he's going through a really low period because his wife has died. She's struggled with tuberculosis for 13 years and she's died. So he is mourning her death. At the same time, he's consumed by guilt because while she was ill, he fell in love with a younger woman called Jean Lecky, and now he's free to marry her, but he's just torn by the guilt, and he says we won't marry for a year in respect for Louise, his wife. So this dark period of his life when he's brooding is when this letter, a fat letter from George Edalji, arrives on his desk, and it says, "Help me! We need you. We need Sherlock Holmes to clear my name." And Arthur Conan Doyle just dives into it. He writes that Edalji took him from a very dark period in his life, and just took his mind away. It was like a distraction for him, and he just gets into this case in full Sherlock Holmes mode, which is fascinating.
Also, one could see, because the response to what Conan Doyle does, his response to his articles, and then the letters that pour in, and the support that he gets. It's a kind of like, he was almost like testing his influence over the people, over the English people, because it almost like, that he was wanting to come out and he was wanting to test that thing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that is obviously, you can, the kind of support that he gets, and more he gets it, the you can see him going from strength to strength, and
Yeah.
supporting him. And there is that genuineness, it was, one could see that he was really wanting to, he was to get justice for George.
For George. Yeah, yeah, totally. He just dived into this case.
Yeah,
He went to the
yeah,
vicarage, he interviewed
mm,
people, he did all the work that the police hadn't done.
yeah,
He made his
yeah,
list of suspects. He did,
mm,
he just said all the evidence is so
mm,
flimsy, it doesn't stand
mm,
ground.
mm,
So he
mm,
worked on that. And and then he went to press. So he wrote these
mm,
two articles in the Daily Telegraph where he
yeah,
was like forensic. He just sort of destroyed all the evidence that had come up and said this was a flawed trial and
mm,
this was a miscarriage of justice. And he really, he's very sharp about the police, how inefficient they were, how misguided they were, and especially how prejudiced they were. So he brings up all these cases, and he's the one who brings up that this family was targeted even before this happened. That when George is just a
mm,
young boy, they received anonymous letters. So
mm.
all this comes up, and this was never brought up at the trial. So he brings up all these facts. He brings up the fact that George was myopic. He says this man could not have crossed the streets at night.
That's
And
very interesting.
it's a really beautiful scene. And
Yeah.
he deduces, like Sherlock Holmes, the first meeting they have is incredible because he says, meet me. And he asks him to meet him at the Grand Hotel in Trafalgar Square. And Arthur Conan Doyle is a little late getting to the meeting. So when he reaches, he just stands near the lobby and he looks. And of course, he can recognize George. He's the only Indian in that room. And he's just like Sherlock Holmes does, the power of deduction, as we, all those who read Sherlock Holmes know how his methods are. So before he's even spoken one word to George, he's deduced. He sees George reading the newspaper, holding it really close to his face. And he says he's myopic. He couldn't have crossed those fields at night, on a sort of English summer day when it's raining, of course, it's pitch dark. And it was in August. And he says, there's no way he could have crossed fields, slashed animals, and come back. So he knows immediately. He's deduced, just like Sherlock Holmes, he's deduced that he couldn't have done it. And he goes. So it is really Sherlockian the way he investigates this whole mystery. And of course, it has several twists and turns, and I'm not going to talk about them because you have to read them. But yeah, that's the way he goes, and he's passionate about it. He is so passionate, and he befriends George. He's really protective about him. So even when he gets married, he marries Jean.
Yeah.
In September in 1907, and one of the guests at the wedding is George Edalji. And you can just imagine, it's a wedding reception of the most elite of London's literary society. All the authors are there. Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula. You have J.M. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan. You have probably, I think, GBS, Shaw was also probably there. So all the great publishers, everybody there. The champagne is flowing, beautifully decorated in this hotel. And there, standing in a corner, is the awkward figure of George Edalji. And Arthur Conan Doyle says he was the guest that he was proudest of. So, there's a real genuine fondness for him over there as well.
There are so many strands in this book that run parallelly. There is the struggle of immigrants, their isolation, the racism. There is this arrogance of bureaucracy, fight for justice, many things.
Mhm.
And almost every major incident of this book resonates with what's happening today. Did you consider this when you chose to write about George, or did you discover this as you went along?
Well, it's only when I started with researching, I didn't know how bad these letters were. I didn't know about these letters. All
Mm,
I knew is that Arthur Conan Doyle had investigated the case. So, the details of the case I had no idea about. But when I saw these letters in the box, this sort of vile language, you can imagine, what racist letters are. I mean, today, now we have trolls who use the same sort of, language.
mm, mm,
But there was not only letters, the house was painted with graffiti, excreta was thrown in through, the window, things were left outside their house. It was a total, sort of under siege is how they felt. There were false letters going out, false advertisements placed, of salacious things like offering sexual services and with the name of the vicar under it. So you can imagine how terrible this is for the vicar. Contact Shahpurji Edalji with some woman advertising her services. So it was that sort of hoax and attack at a very deeply hurtful level, and also dangerous. Because can you imagine how terrified they must have felt seeing, I'm going to murder your son, basically. 12-year-old son saying, I can bet 50 pounds that he'll be in his grave, soon, things like that.
and
And
they ordered various, all kinds of things in his name, and material started landing at his vicarage.
every sort of oppression. But the thing
Yeah.
was, when I read all these, I was, just thinking that yes, miscarriages of justice have happened here in Britain so much. You had, especially with the IRA, you had the Guildford 4, Birmingham 6. These are very famous English
Yeah.
cases here where police manipulated files. And this same sort of thing was happening here. I mean, still happening. And of course, racism is something, while last year while I was finishing the book and finishing the edits and the pandemic was on is when Black Lives Matter exploded
Mm,
around the world, in the Western world. And my goodness, it was like all over, and you just felt Yes, I mean, George's story is over 100 years ago, but this is still happening. Suddenly, everyone was pouring their stories out. It's um, one knows about Paki bashing that happened in the 70s and 80s and everything, and all these shopkeepers would have their shops painted, Paki written on it, and they would just paint it the next day, clean it up, mend the windows which were shattered, and just get back to work. That's how the immigrants worked those days. I felt Shahpurji was doing that 100 years ago, but when Black Lives Matter exploded last year, it was like famous footballers coming out, famous cricketers coming out and saying what they had faced. And these are celebrities who were talking about it. Um, and and our ordinary people as well. And you just felt that this is still happening. We know it's happening. This is sort of underlying tension that is always there, that is ready to explode. And it was glaring that this is still going on. And they're just blindsiding it. We just had a report published last week which said, oh, Britain is a shining example to the Western world on racism, and we are the best. So I mean, it's been laughed at, the report, but this was a government commission report, so it just has no merit at all. Because institutional racism does exist, and they have said this over and over again. And prejudice exists.
Yeah, it's unconscious bias, but what we see in
Absolutely.
the book is,
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
more
George was
pronounced.
before he was even in the dock. They didn't need, they just seen his face. And in fact, he tells a policeman later, no, he tells a journalist later, many years later, that the police should know that if somebody has a name that you can't pronounce, they may not necessarily be a foreigner. And every foreigner has not done the most gruesome crime. And I thought that was, really quite touching, as well as just makes so much sense. And also now, it's still relevant today because even during the pandemic, you had, because everyone was in lockdown, who was stopped and searched the most if they were out on the street? It was Black and Asian people. Straight away. Who was fined the most? Black and Asian people. Simply, that is how it is. There was a Black MP who was driving her car at a Mercedes with a friend in East London, and she was pulled up. And she had to say, I'm an MP. This is my car. How can a Black woman drive a Mercedes in East London? So it's just these prejudices and these biases that keep coming up, which are still there in society and around the world. I won't say it's just Britain,
Yeah.
it's America, it's India, it's
So
everywhere.
it's there in different forms and different ways, and which is why I said they resonate so much with even what's happening in India. So
Exactly.
it is there in as I said in different forms, and
Exactly.
absolutely, you know, uh,
It's where
a
it's
terrible
color of your
thing.
skin, somewhere it's your race, somewhere it's your caste, somewhere it's your religion. It
Yeah,
varies things. And the fear of
exactly.
the foreigner is universal.
Yeah,
Somebody who's there, he's an alien. We don't
yeah,
want him.
yeah,
Here we had Brexit, that was
yeah,
fueled entirely by, fear of the foreigner. In this case, East Europeans, they didn't want them coming.
mm,
In America, they built a wall to keep the Mexicans out.
yeah.
So it just happens everywhere.
You have this enormous material which you went through, and obviously you have to put a frame to present it to us. So which means that a lot of things get left out. Is there anything that was that you feel was important, but because of the size of your frame that you left out in this while constructing this book?
I could have gone on with the details of everything, the various
Mm,
cases, the media reports, and also the investigation that Arthur Conan Doyle does. But I just had to cut it because I just felt this is just
mm,
too much detail. And, the reader, he's going to get lost. And the last thing you want to do is get the reader confused
yeah.
because, it's really hard. So I tried to keep it simple. So, if you get confused, I did my best, to all the readers. But
I
there's a lot
didn't get
happening
confused.
there.
Absolutely, yes.
There is so much going on, and you have to distill it into a narrative. So it was really quite hard to write because of so many things. It's not just a clear narrative. Say a book like Spy Princess, in that sense, just narration was easier
Mm, mm,
because it
mm,
is from it is following her life. It's a short life. It's one life, and things that are happening around it. But something like this, where there are two strands, two people from different ends, It's a bit like Victoria and Abdul in that sense. Two people from different ends of the spectrum meeting. But here there's a case going on, there's a crime, there's all sorts of things happening. So it was hard to distill and do. But anyway, I hope they like it. I hope the reader
Yeah,
likes it.
it is. May I request you to read a couple of passages from the
Yeah,
book?
sure. Let me read one when George is in prison. He is. I've read the press, and now, so after his sentence is passed, then George goes to prison. He's taken to Cannock police station, the local. It's the police lockup, so it's not the jail yet. Cannock police station had two small cells for the detention of prisoners. George was locked in one. He described it later as the worst cell he had ever seen or heard of. As they closed the door on him, it was almost pitch dark. It had no gas or other artificial light. He was told he could not have a lamp or candle lest he set fire to himself. There was no bell, and the only way to attract attention was to thump or kick the door. This he did loudly at one point in the night, and was told that he had disturbed a policeman who was saying his prayers before he left on duty. The only furniture in the cell was a fixed bench, which worked as a chair, table, and bed. A constable needled him. "Well, Mr. Edalji," he said, "I'm sorry to see you here. But how did you manage to slip by all our chaps? What time did you put the horse through it? Give the show away, or someone else will." Through the evening, the police tried to make him talk so he could incriminate himself, but George would not oblige. His training as a lawyer had taught him that prisoners often had their words twisted out of context and ended up in trouble for what they said casually at the police station. All night long, the police kept a strict watch to see that he could not attempt suicide. The cell was pitch dark and he could see nothing. Every hour, from 8 p.m. till 2 a.m., an officer would come with a lantern to check on him and try to make him talk. On the sixth appearance, George told him not to come again, and he went away. There was no water in the cell. When George asked for some, he was told he could not have any because prisoners tried to drown themselves by holding their heads under water in the bucket. Finally, well past 2 a.m., tired, thirsty, and worried, George fell into a troubled sleep. It had been exactly 10 years since the last anonymous letter declared that George Edalji would be sent to his grave. So this is George's first night in the cell. As you can see, it's a horrible night because he himself is a solicitor, so he's defended people, but here he is for the first time in a jail. In a police lockup. It wasn't the jail at this stage, it's the police lockup. He goes to the jail afterwards. And the jail, like every other jail, sounds horrible. A Victorian prison, police lockup would have been absolutely horrible.
Will this book also be made into a film?
That is not in my hands, Vivek. It's up to studios and filmmakers. But yes, we've had interest, but it's not in my hands, and we just have to wait and see what happens.
It's an interesting book, and there's so many twists, and it's almost it's like a thriller, more than a thriller, of course.
Well, I can never be as good as Arthur Conan Doyle, but I have to pay him respect, and so write it in his style. At least try to do that. Yeah.
I know the book is just out, and it may be too early to expect any responses. But have you got any response from Indian community in UK or Parsi community?
Well, it's got great reviews so far, so that's the one good thing.
Yeah.
That is, it's really been reviewed in nearly all the papers, and they've just given an excellent review, said Sherlockian, and said all the new material is really interesting. So most have found all that really interesting, especially the fight between Arthur Conan Doyle and Anson, who is the police chief.
Yeah.
So that bit is also very exciting because that really dominates the last bit of the book because they are at it. Anson is the police chief who's racist, who hates George Edalji, and who describes Shahpurji as the Hindu vicar and just hates the family. And he does everything to stop Arthur Conan Doyle, investigating this. So he lays false traps for him. He does, all sorts of police things. He's a real corrupt cop. but he's a really imperialist and an aristocrat. So that is also interesting. So there's one aristocrat, Anson, and there's Arthur Conan Doyle, who's the best known writer, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and their clash over this case is fascinating. So yeah, the reviews have been great. People coming, like today I got an email, so I'm always waiting for relatives or somebody to contact me. I want to find that Edalji family, whatever was left of it in Bombay, because Shahpurji had brothers and sisters. They must be there somewhere, their descendants. George and his sister Maud, they had no children, so their family line is finished. The children didn't have children, any others. So that line is over. But there must be Idaljis in Bombay, who were Shahpurji's brothers and sisters, and they must have had children. So there's somebody around. It would be lovely if they came forward. But today I got an email from somebody who said she was George's relative from his mother's side. So George's grandmother's sister is her line of ancestry. And it's a lovely email where she said her father had told her they were related to George, but she didn't know how. And she worked it out when she read my book. And then I write about George's grave because I went and found his grave, and it was just covered in weeds. You couldn't find it. It took me 4 hours to find this grave. And so she went with her husband, and they went to the grave and they looked at it. They said it is really in a bad state, but they hope to go and repair it soon. So that's nice. And she says she hoped that her ancestors had looked after George and been there to support him when he was in trouble. So that's nice. So it's always nice when people come up and give little anecdotes and their connections. There are people from Great Wyrley who said, "Oh, we were born in Great Wyrley, and I was baptized in that same church, St. Mary's Church, and I had no idea about this story. So thank you." So I get a lot of mail like that, which is, it's a story that's been forgotten. So people even in the area don't really know that much about it, which is great. So it's good to tell them that all this happened. Arthur Conan Doyle came to this village to investigate a case, and put it on the world map in a way, because George became famous even in the US. This article
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
carried even in
And
the New York.
there is this wonderful part where Conan Doyle,
Yes.
goes and finds out, a character in the US. I won't talk about
Yeah.
it much, but then it's the most interesting bit
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the book, because it's so far away, and then still look at the
Mhm.
coincidence. I don't know whether it's a coincidence or it's still a mystery, but then something like that happening is really wonderful.
Yeah, it was amazing. And also because the articles were published in the Washington Post as well
Mm,
and New York
mm,
Times. So, they got to know. And of course, Arthur Conan Doyle is big in the US. So they got fascinated with this real life case that he was investigating. So George became quite famous. But anyway, he had a very tortured life, but he did become quite famous at the time. Oh, anyway. But he was a fighter. I do feel he had a good fight in him. He continued continued campaigning, continued, and
and
had
it's
the
so heartening to see that he did not let it go, and his spirits were high.
Mhm.
Despite, because if you see the kind of violence that was inflicted on him from his childhood,
Yeah.
uh, and his loneliness, and he was, it's not that he had great support. Of course, once Condell came into the
Mm-hmm.
scene, that is different, but then even before that, his ability to fight, and that holding on to that hope is something extraordinary.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. I mean, this man was faced racism as a child. Then there's all this crime. He's then imprisoned. He spends 3 years with hardened
Mhm.
criminals,
Yeah.
and he writes that the person next to him. I have some of the accounts of the jail because he himself wrote about
Mm,
it. So
mm.
he wrote the article in Pearson's Weekly. In fact, we have a photo, Nirika. Maybe you'd like to bring that up, of the articles that George himself wrote and which were published at the time. Um, Nirika, would you like to bring up that photo? It's an advertisement of one of George's articles. So he was, quite involved in getting his story across. So I would say he did good PR for himself. He spoke to journalists quite openly.
Mm.
He wrote the articles himself. He had the gall to, how many people have the guts to pick up a pen and write to Arthur Conan Doyle? He did. No, not yeah, this one. So this is
Yeah.
an article that George Edalji himself wrote. As you can see, was he innocent? Edalji's story. So we have a lot of the details. Thanks, Nireka. Yeah, you could take that away now. So we have a lot of details from his writings about, we can see that he's in for the fight. He says, I will fight for compensation right till the end. So, good for him. He had quite a fighting spirit, I think. And also, I do think it's good. I mean, he did face so much racism, but also let's not forget he also had 10,000 people who supported him. Who wrote
Yeah.
that petition, and 10,000 is a large number in those days. So there were top lawyers, doctors, academics, writers, all supporting him and saying this is a flawed case. And it was the sort of English spirit that a miscarriage of justice won't be tolerated. That fighting spirit sort of came out, and I think it's one of the things that Arthur Conan Doyle also felt very strongly, because even though he's a creature of empire, he believes in empire, he believes in all this. He still he sees empire as a benevolent force. He sees it as something that brings democracy, justice, all these good things to people, apart from cricket and tea, of course. But so when that is challenged and there is a miscarriage, he feels he must fight it. So in a way,
And
he's fighting.
and also, yeah, and also interestingly, he does not think that he's an outsider. See,
Yeah.
while everyone else around him treats him so, but he does not. I mean, there is no evidence for that anywhere in the book or in his letters, because he thinks he is one of them.
Yeah, he thinks he's
He,
English. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Which he is. I mean, he's what they call people from Birmingham. Yeah, they call them Brummies. You have a Brummie accent. I mean, he probably spoke with a Brummie accent, because he is English. His father himself had left, his Parsi faith behind, left his country behind, and come here. So, what is there that is Indian left in Edalji? But he was very proud of his name. He would always say, "This is how it is to be pronounced." He would write that Edalji. you know, so those little things also show that he is quite proud of his name and his heritage, Parsi heritage, whatever. Even though he's Christian now, but he makes it a point to correct people and write it in the articles how to pronounce his name. So these little things show you his character. It's a glimpse into this man. He's quite a mysterious person. We don't know that much about him.
Shrabani, maybe we can open it up for questions if there are any.
Yeah, yeah.
Nirika, are there any questions?
Nothing yet, but if anyone wants to ask a question, just reminding you, you can add it in the comment section
Okay.
and we'll take them. So if anyone has any questions. Meanwhile, y'all can go ahead. I think if there's a question, I'll alert you.
Sure, sure.
Shrabani,
Okay.
maybe another passage would you like to read?
Yeah, sure. Let me think of one. Let's get something from. Okay, this is a funny one from the trial. Let's get the trial. So, poor George. You've seen his picture when he has been arrested. He's wearing this three-piece check suit, and he's not allowed to change. So he keeps wearing the same. Then he thinks, okay. Okay, I'll read a short passage. So this is a chapter called A Trial in Staffordshire. And it's about, it's the trial. To the gathered media and crowds, the man sitting in the front of the Staffordshire Quarter Sessions Court on 20th October looked every bit the dark Oriental with a deep secret. His eyes were slightly bulgy, his lips were thick, and he had a prominent cleft on his chin. He had a thick moustache, and his dark hair was neatly combed. It was 2 months since his arrest on that fateful August morning. Present in the courtroom were his parents, Shahpurji and Charlotte, and his sister Maud. His grey-haired mother took notes as the hearing progressed. His elderly father, who had conducted Sunday services for so many years in the local church, and who had married the residents of the village and consoled them at the funerals of their loved ones, now looked helpless and forlorn, the tension of the last few months clearly showing on his face. The family looked a model of righteousness and honor, unlikely relatives of a man accused of such heinous crimes. Also seated in the courtroom was Elizabeth Foster, the maid who had been fired from the Edalji house and sworn her revenge. It was not clear whether she had been brought in as a witness. The Staffordshire police were out in full force to give evidence, under the watchful eye of their chief, Captain Anson. The tension in the courtroom could be cut with a knife. Okay, I'll skip this little detail. Before his trial, George had asked for permission to change his clothing as he had been wearing the summer suit he had been arrested in for the last 3 months. The request was refused. Prisoners were required to be tried in the clothes worn when apprehended. George was told that a prisoner or a murder charge in a nearby cell had to appear in his bloodied clothes so the jurors could see the full horror of the crime. That, thought George, was an acceptable rule for a prisoner denied bail. However, as someone who had been granted bail and would have been allowed to stay at home if he'd wanted, excuse me, George questioned the rule. But the police were firm. He was not even allowed to change his shoes or the straw hat he had worn in August, and which was totally unsuitable for late October. Excuse me. George felt that his unsuitable clothes and appearance itself could prejudice a jury who were not aware of the rules. The day before his trial, he asked to be shaved, but was told that such a thing was unheard of at Stafford. He could only be clipped with the nippers. Since the court was sitting from early morning till late, there was no chance for him to get a clip. Consequently, George appeared before the jury, the press, and the public, sporting a light three-piece check suit, a worn-out boot, and a rather overgrown moustache. The Sunderland Daily Echo reported the prisoner was unshaven, and his appearance was even more oriental than before. His thick lips were pursed, and his large black eyes fixed on the witnesses. So you can see that George, I mean, he is marked by his appearance, really. It just dogs him all the way. And but the funny thing is, excuse me, the minute that he has the backing of Arthur Conan Doyle, this whole press changes its tune. Suddenly, Sherlock Holmes is investigating the case, and they're all championing George. They say he could never have done it, and his Asiatic appearance should not be the reason he is sentenced. So, complete change. The minute you have a little celebrity backing, it shows what you can do, and that is what happens to George. So it's all, it reflects the society as well. The whole case reflects what's going on in society. And, this sort of coverage happens even now at all court trials and everything else. So everyone is judged the whole time by the media. You have these media trials everywhere. And so it's so relevant, I feel, even today.
I think we have maybe a couple of minutes. If there are no other questions, then I have a last question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There is one question. Saz asked, did he and his family visit India over the years?
Oh, no. No. Once Shahpurji left India, he never went back. And George, of course, had no connections with India. It was very interesting for me because at this time that all this is happening, in British politics, the only 3 MPs who ever joined the House of Commons were Parsis. So the first Indian MP in the House of Commons is Dadabhai Nauroji, somebody, Indians know very well as the Grand Old Man of India. And so he is elected in 1892 and he lasts 1 term. And then he's followed by another MP called Mancharji Bhawnagri, who was also Parsi and also, but he was a Tory. So Dadabhai was a liberal, Mancharji is a Tory. And then we had the third MP, who's Shahpurji Saklatwala. He was also born in Bombay, came here, and he is from the Communist Party. So we had the only 3 MPs of Indian origin, pre-independence, are all Parsis. And what I found is that one of them was actually a sitting MP at the time when all this is happening, these trials, 1906. But Shahpurji I saw no evidence that he ever went to these MPs and asked for help and said what he was going through. Because Dadabhai Nauroji was also from Elphinstone College. There's a direct bond over there. They're all from Bombay. But I think he had left his Parsi roots behind and he was proud he didn't go back to them. So he just went to the police and he went to the press and he tried his best. But yeah, that's how it happened. They had no connection left with India. I'm hoping some Indian family show up and say, Edalji is out there. So the father, Shahpurji's father, is called Doralji Edalji, and Shahpurji had brothers and sisters. There must be some Edaljis around. And
There is a question, Shrabani, which is related to what you are saying.
Mhm.
Sonia is asking whether this was covered by the Indian press at that time.
Yes, it wasn't covered by the Indian press, but it was noticed by Jawaharlal Nehru, who wrote a letter to his father,
Yeah.
Motilal Nehru. Now, Nehru at that time was a student. He was an 18-year-old student in Harrow School. And he saw the press coverage and he wrote to his father saying that this is incredible press coverage that it's getting. And this poor man was probably targeted because he was an Indian. So it's noticed by Nehru, but I didn't see. I mean, saw no evidence of it being covered by the local Indian media. Um, so unfortunate. Maybe there were some articles, when Arthur Conan Doyle came, but I haven't seen any.
Okay, my last question to you is which event of history is now haunting you? What's your next book?
Oh God, what has been haunting me in the whole of last year was this lockdown. So I need to, we've all been just working endlessly, and it's been very busy because I'm a journalist as well. So the work comes first, and then this. In fact, before our talk there's been like quite a tragedy here because the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, has died,
Yeah.
and the news broke just after noon today. So for the 2 hours just before I went, came on the show, I was filing about his death. So yeah, 99. He would have turned 100 in the summer, but so it is quite sad, and one is quite used to seeing him with the Queen. But um, yeah, so it's been a very very hectic year, and yeah, I think one needs a break. I've not had a holiday at all, and things will stir, but I'm in no hurry. I'm not putting pressure on myself. But there's always something that stirs, and I'm sure something will come up. But I take a long time to write my books, so it'll be a while before people
How
will.
long did you take for this book?
This took 5 years. Yeah.
Okay,
But
that's
there were little breaks because in between Victoria and Abdul got made into the film. So, I was distracted with because I was a consultant on that. So there was a little bit of all that. And then a lot of traveling because of Victoria and Abdul, doing endless talks. But more or less it took 5 years. Yeah. Right up till last year and the final drafting and rewriting and restructuring. That is the toughest. What do you keep in? It's probably like a film. What do you keep in on the cutting room floor, or what do you throw out?
yeah.
But how do you make this narrative? Where do you come into the plot? It's all these things that have to be sorted out. So yeah,
Thank you,
I'll give it.
Shamani. Thank you for your time and thank you for this fabulous, wonderful book.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for your books, which have always, endeared to everybody. That's just fabulous. So, oh, your Gacha Gocha should be on screen, Vivek. I would like to see that. That is such a charming, book. It's amazing.
Thank you so
So
much.
thank you. I hope more get translated so we can read more.
Thank you
Over to
both
you,
so
Nitik.
much again. Yeah, thank you both so much. That was an absolutely lovely conversation. To everyone watching, you can get a copy of the book on our website, both Gacha Gocha and the Mystery of the Parsi Lawyer. So yeah, please do check out the book, and we hope to see both of you and all of our viewers someday in our store.
I'm sure it'll happen. Thank you, Nirika. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Vivek.
Thank you.
Take
Thank you,
care,
Nitik.
everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye bye.